Life is messy. So messy that we often feel like we're moving backwards. Like for each step towards a more hopeful, more just, more contented world, we end up taking like 2 steps back. Such feelings leave us with a feeling like we should abandon hope. In the midst of that, how do we inspire the hopeful journey of progress? How do we engage in faith when it feels like faith is an empty promise? Oh boy, if you've ever asked those questions, then I hope you'll settle in and give this episode of Compass a listen. Compass is meant to orient us towards the divine movement in everyday life. That includes the instances when life is really, really messy, or worse. My name is Ryan Dunn. In this episode, I got to talk with Bishop Jake Owensby, who is the Bishop of the Episcopal Church in Western Louisiana. He's the author of 5 books on everyday spirituality. He's a speaker and a retreat leader. And Jake focuses on helping people discover meaning and purpose in their own lives. His most recent book is Looking for God in Messy Places. It is such an uplifting read for times like this. I spoke with Bishop Owensby in late summer, in the midst of hurricane season, just after his diocese in Louisiana had been visited by storms. In fact, this interview was rescheduled due to the storms. So it was natural that our conversation about hope and God's presence started with some talk about where God moved in the midst of that particular turn of events. So we'll start there on this episode of Compass. Bishop Owensby, thank you so much for joining us at this time. I'm very appreciative that you're here. You've written a book about finding God and finding hope in the messy places. And where you're at right now in Louisiana, I think life has been a little bit messy over the past couple weeks. How have you been witnessing love showing up in the midst of that?
Gosh, yeah, Ryan, it has been messy. In fact, it's been messy for a while because we got hit by back-to-back hurricanes last year. We got another one this year. And in between all of that, we had an ice storm. And there's been a lot of destruction. There's been not only destruction of buildings, but economic destruction. Jobs disappeared. Folks lost their homes and can't get back into them. We're still rebuilding and will be for a long time. So love's showing up here with hands and feet, with compassion. People in Louisiana are remarkably neighborly. We're a pretty good bunch, and we show up and help people rebuild their homes. We feed them. But in particular, my denomination teams up with people. You know, we don't try to stay in a silo. And we've been teaming up, doing some pretty remarkable recovery work, putting floors in, putting wheelchair ramps back in, making sure people get food. And just this week, you know, we're bringing food to folks who are still from Ida in hotel rooms. People have been displaced in remarkable ways, and we're just figuring out every possible way we can help them out. So, yeah, it's pretty messy here in Louisiana, but love keeps rolling.
Well, we can hope that the mess in some way gets resolved. We can also wish that the mess in some way gets resolved. So how do you differentiate hope from wishful thinking?
You know, when I first used that distinction, I know Ann Lamott a little, and she was really nice to read some early stuff and comment. And Annie said, you're kind of harshing on the idea of wishful thinking. And so I wanted to look back at that. And so let me say, and I still, go with what I said in the book, obviously. Let me say this, there's nothing in the world wrong with wanting certain outcomes. You know, like when my daughter had to have open heart surgery as a toddler, I wanted that to go well, Ryan. That's tough stuff. And who doesn't want that to go well? So I'm not saying to folks, cut off the idea of hoping for an outcome. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's something deeper than that, aiming toward the way things will turn out. There's something deeper than looking for a set of circumstances that would make you happy. Because where our hope comes from is that God's always there. God is always there. We are always the beloved of God, and we can love as a result of that, no matter what our circumstances are. And that's where I'm distinguishing wishful thinking from hope. Sometimes I think well-intentioned, really faithful people are under what I think is an unfortunate misconception, that if they had enough faith, if they just believed hard enough, or if they prayed just the right way,
Yeah.
then God will give them the future that they yearn for. And I've done so much pastoral work, man. I see that can lead to some real devastation, because things don't always turn out the way we want them to. And that doesn't mean that God doesn't love us. That doesn't mean that God didn't show up for us. It doesn't mean that we failed as people who love Christ. It means that bad stuff happens to good people, and God shows up in the midst of it. And that's where I try to draw the distinction. Hope comes from God's love for us and our ability to pour that love out in even the most wretched, heart-wrenching circumstances.
Do you see that hope as something being active, or does it invite us into activity?
That's a great question. And for me, faith, hope, and love are all about what are you going to do? I'm not saying that the interior life isn't important. Sure it is. How we feel about things, how we think about things, but it's how the rubber meets the road. Hope is, I'm going to get out there and do something about it. Okay. Right? You were asking me about how it's going in Louisiana. Well, hope and love show themselves in showing up, right? Asking people, how can I engage you in the middle of this mess? And no matter what, I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not leaving you in this. We're going to get through this thing together. And it might be hard and it might take a long time, but we're not giving up. We're in it together. The distinction between orthodoxy and orthopraxy, right? I mean, orthodoxy is thinking the right way. And I'm not harshing on that either. I'm just saying that I do tip toward orthopraxy.
Okay, which is correct practice.
Correct praxis. Okay. Yeah, right. Yeah. And for me, that's love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. Love your neighbor for me as yourself means we kind of share a spiritual circulatory system, right? My well-being and yours, we just can't separate those things.
So if our hope is in God and God's action, is it reasonable or right then to just kind of lay into God for fixing things?
Listen, I got to tell you, if you read the Psalms, you can lay into God any old thing you want, right?
Yep.
I mean, there's some stuff in there that makes your blood run cold, right? I mean, bash your baby's heads against the rock is one of the things.
Yeah, and a lot of paranoia. I've actually been reading quite a few of the Psalms lately, and it's just, it amazes me how much the language is about everybody's out to get me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And for me, what that means is that, look, bring yourself to God the way you really are. Right? It's really okay that you are furious with God, that your heart is broken. Let's use the example of my daughter. If my daughter had not had a successful outcome, I would have been not only devastated, but I would. Well, in fact, let me tell you a story. If you got the time,
Absolutely.
My daughter is also neurodivergent, and so we learned about her being in the autism spectrum at a certain point when she was little. And I got to tell you, I was hacked at God. I was just furious. I mean, who dreams of anything other than sort of neurotypical kid going to go to Harvard thing, right? Or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Or maybe be the greatest fisherman in the world or whatever, ice skater. But at any rate, I remember being furious with God and taking a night walk, which I like to do, to walk under the stars, and railing at him. How dare you? Here I am, and this is a stupid way to view being an ordained person, but I was saying, here, it's not like I went into the ordained ministry for the money, for crying out loud.
No.
And no, right? And I'm having to sometimes walk away from the Thanksgiving table and all this other stuff because I'm pouring out love to these people, and you hand me this, right? It's really okay to want those things and to wrestle with God about that. Jacob, look at my name, right? Rename me to Israel and you get wrestle with God. So what I'm saying is, look, don't just meekly say, oh, I don't want anything. Be really honest with God, but recognize that God's love is so powerful and sense it. Allow yourself to have the kind of spiritual life where you get it in your marrow that you're God's beloved. God's there. I mean, really, it's not some abstract notion. God's right here, right in the middle of this messy life that we have. And that's going to sustain us. That's really, and it has for me. I have to tell you, in tough times, sensing the presence of God, really being aware of that, and God being God in the midst of that has been the difference maker for me. And I think for some other folks that I know.
Well, in line with that, you suggest that not only are we present with God, but we are the presence of God. Maybe I'm reading into your words something that I wanted to see there, but that in a way, like, do you see it as like God doesn't really show up until we show up in a way? Like if we're talking about some of the mess in Louisiana, is God there if we're not showing up to help ease the burdens of others?
Gosh, that's a great question. Now, late Marcus Borg once said something like, I can't quote my address, so this is going to be a paraphrase of Marcus Borg. We can't without God, but God won't without us. And another way of looking at it for me is, God is there, but it becomes actual in what we do. It's not as if God is ever going to stand back and be a kind of disinterested witness. But because God is the way God is all about relationship and all about working through us. You're exactly right. God becomes visible in what we do. I hate to say it. I'm going to say it, and, folks can disagree with me or even be mad at me for saying this, but I think sometimes the reason there aren't more Christians is Christians. And I don't mean to bust on people for being bad so much as to say sometimes we don't get in there and get our fingers involved so that the dirt gets under our fingernails. Yeah. I think more of that helps people see more of Christ.
So you intone that the way that we live is the way in which we encounter the presence of God. And you make a great differentiation between living and surviving. Can you describe a little bit of that for us? What's the difference between living and surviving?
Yeah, all of us have a survival instinct. I mean, that's just part of being a creature here on earth. And that means we need to get food and we need shelter and all those basic things to keep us from dying. At the end of the day, the survival instinct is about let's avoid death. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, it's a good thing. It's how God made us. But we humans, I suspect other creatures too, but that's another conversation. We need more than that. We need a why. What makes this worth it? What makes it worth going through all this tough stuff? And for that matter, what makes a life worth living where I'm actually having to maybe give my life away? What makes a parent run into a burning building to save a child? Or for that matter, a first responder. I think about firefighters running into these buildings. What makes that worth it? They're risking their lives. And that's an amazing thing. And, in the book, I talk about my mom's experience in Mauthausen, the concentration camp in Austria. And there's a lot of terrific concentration camp and the Shoah literature. And what made people not just survive, but some of them actually thrive in a way, spiritually, psychologically, made them more human in that environment. And what I think we see in many of those reports is that the people who, they survived, but they became less human. They were the ones willing to steal food from somebody else. They were the ones willing to even be capos. Those were the sort of collaborators with the prison guards. The ones who became examples of, I kind of want to be that when I grow up. They were the ones willing to give a crust of bread to a hungry person, help them get by just one more day. In other words, they got over themselves by loving their neighbor.
Mm.
And that's, I think, the core why of what it is to be a human. I believe Scripture when it says we're created in God's image, right there in the first chapter, right? And so what I take that to mean is when we become truly human, we love. We love our neighbor as ourselves.
Mm.
And so I think, like I said, I'm not harshing the idea of survival. Of course, it's good to do the things you need to do to survive, but to live a fulfilling life, to have the sense that, man, this is really worth it, and I can get through any set of circumstances, we need a why.
Mm. You mentioned giving our lives away. It's certainly one of the tough sayings or teachings of Jesus. How is giving our lives away an expression of hope? It feels so negative, right? I have to sacrifice. How is that an expression of hope?
Yeah. Something, following Jesus is just full of paradox, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and that's probably, for me at least, the central one. That to live a life is to give your life away. To really live is to walk the way of the cross. Yikes. Take up your cross and follow me. What ad agency is going to put that out there? Right? Nobody, right? You're not going to sell Nikes that way.
Yeah. There's a little too much explanation that has to go in there for a 30-second ad. Yeah.
It all boils down to love for me, all right? I mean, for me, faith and hope emerge out of love. I mean, that Pauline triad, right, is that faith, hope, and love, these are some pretty wonderful things, but love's the bottom line. Giving yourself away is what love is. That doesn't mean to obliterate yourself. It doesn't mean to underestimate yourself or devalue yourself. It means to enter into relationship. We find ourselves by giving ourselves to the other. Love your neighbor as yourself includes loving yourself, after all. It really does. But you're also getting over yourself. You can love yourself in the way where you're all caught up in yourself, right? I mean, you can just be all, and that's what survival is in a way. If that's all that you're doing, is you're all just about do whatever it is you perceive in a selfish way that you need, and to heck with everybody else. The way I put it a lot of times is this: are you about a life where you're making a better place for yourself in the world? Or are you about a life where you're making the world a better place for everybody?
That's convicting.
And I know. Every morning, look in the mirror and go, you're not living that way. But that's what I think giving your life away is about, where you say, I'm going to be a common good guy, right? The common good is what I'm about. And in the end, my true self emerges there, because I'm about a web of relationships that makes us all who we are. I see you in me. I see Christ in you. I see me in you. You, I hope, see yourself in me. That's how that all works. That's what I mean by giving yourself away. And that's where we find hope. Can I tell you another story? I'll tell you
Absolutely.
Another story if you got a minute. My mom, whom I write about a lot, and I was really tight with my mom. And by the way, her funeral was the first one that I did as a clergy type, right? My mom, her last job was to work behind the deli counter in a grocery store. I mean, she was a working class person. My family was working class. And my mom loved that job. And it was because she got to know her customers, and she knew the kind of stuff that they liked. She knew kind of what they were going to come and get for lunch and what sandwich they were going to make, and so she'd say hi to them. And when my mom died, people would come in and say, where's the nice lady who, right? So my mom found a purpose in life by finding what it was in that very specific way to be helpful to another person. You don't have to jump off a cliff to give yourself away. You can just notice people, see that they're people, that they have a life, that they have loves in their life. go to the grocery store and actually pay attention to the people working there, to the people in line in front of you and behind you. Gosh, these are all humans with tender desires and heartaches and fears and worries, and getting caught up in all that and having it matter to you, that's giving your life away. And there's hope in that.
Mm. How do you see a larger body like the church cultivating the we, quote unquote, we?
Yeah. Well, I'll just be straight up. Sometimes we don't, right? I think we're going through a season now where maybe the Holy Spirit, through the challenges we're facing with COVID and the social challenges that we're facing, not just in the United States, but worldwide, where the Holy Spirit is saying, let's remake this church. Let's remember who Jesus is and what it means to follow Jesus. I think, for what it's worth, who the heck am I, right? But I think that church is church. When we realize Jesus is out there already, our role isn't to, let's see if we can attract as many people into these pews as we possibly can, right? I think the church is being church when we're out in the world and we embrace our neighbors and we together say, what are our challenges and what can we do about this? That's where the church makes a we. Now, there's more than that. You know, in the Episcopal Church, you know, we're Eucharistically centered. And we see that already when we gather around the Eucharistic table. I mean, there's nothing quite like gathering along, like like we have altar rails. You can go up and you can kneel at the altar rail and you look up and down. And if you're really fortunate, you're at a pretty diverse congregation. And you'll see farmers and you'll see bankers and you'll see black and you'll see white and you'll see folks who speak other languages all along the same table, all along the same altar rail. And you realize, oh, wow, that's me. That's us. All right. And so I'll tell you a story. You know, I'm doing this whole story thing. So hang in there, Ryan.
Yeah, bring it.
Maybe you've heard this story about our presiding bishop and how his dad, who wasn't Episcopalian, became an Episcopalian and became an Episcopal priest. Michael Curry is an African American. He's a black man, and I love him to pieces. I quote him in my book. He's my leader and my friend, and I admire him so much. He said this story. His dad and his mom, I think they were engaged actually at the time, and she took him to the Episcopal Church. Now, remind you, you know, this is like before desegregation. And the Episcopalians drink communion from a common cup, right? And so here are these two black folks going to the same church with a whole bunch of white folks too, and communion comes and they're going up to receive communion, and he's seeing them all in a line up at the altar rail, white folks and black folks, and there's this one cup. In the age of black-only water fountains, and he sees them all drinking out of the same cup. And that's when his dad said, now that's the church for me. That's the church for me too, man. And that's the church we need to be. That's the church that's Jesus's church. That we're all drinking out of the same cup because we're all Jesus's people. Whether we're rich or we're poor, we're black or we're white, we're native or we're European, we got some stuff to work out there. Some serious stuff to work out. But if we can drink from the same cup, whether we do that literally or not, I know there are different traditions. You all probably have a different tradition from that. But, you know, metaphorically, that's how we do that. That's how we're the we.
Yeah, I think in our Methodist tradition, it may not be the cup, but it's the loaf. The same idea is there. You know, the presence is there. Like, hey, we all share in the same body. We share in the same loaf. We're going to switch a little bit from the institutional to the personal, as you've called yourself a worldly mystic. How do you practice your mysticism? Like, do you have some favorite contemplative practices?
Yeah. And that's meant to be a kind of jarring pairing of two words. And so let's start with mystic and we'll go to worldly while I decided that. You know, I think what you see about mysticism, Christian mysticism and other mysticisms, right? Other faith traditions have mystics. And where we have something in common there with other great faith traditions is a deep desire for union with God. I mean, that's the key, I think, to or the core of mysticism, is that yearning for union with the holy. And in my view, that means also union with the beloved children of God. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of folks, I think, assume that that's an otherworldly thing, that you got to have these visions where you're a la Paul outside of your own body, and you go to some other place, right? And I'm not knocking that. I mean, I've had a couple of doozy experiences. Maybe you have too, and they're wowzer experiences. But I call myself a worldly mystic because my practices are part of finding God in the messy places of this life. I'm a worldly mystic in the sense that, I believe we really can encounter God in our everyday comings and goings, in everybody that we meet, including the person we meet in the mirror, at work, at school, in the grocery, in the playground. We can encounter God there. And when we don't, it's because we're too busy, or we're too frightened, or we become absorbed with this, that, or the other thing. Yeah. And my prayer life, it's a pretty Episcopalian thing, really, to be a person who prays what we call them the daily offices. Some people call them the hours, or the prayer hours. They really come from ancient synagogue practices and Jewish home practices, and then monastic practices. I pray the daily offices, at the very least, morning and evening prayer. Eucharistic worship is at the center of that too, because in the Eucharist, we're reminded, when we have communion, we're reminded, hey, God shows up even at ordinary supper, right? In all these ordinary places. That's what that's meant to remind us of. Open your eyes. There's where God is. And the way I talk about praying the offices is this. I don't know about you, man, but my life can be one doggone thing after another, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And it's almost like, okay, it's like this. Imagine a page of letters with no punctuation at all, no separation between words, and trying to make sense out of that. What a headache, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you punctuate it, you got to separate out words too, but put in periods and commas and question marks and exclamation marks, and you make sentences, and then you make paragraphs, meaning leaps out, right? And so the way this sort of Benedictine prayer life works, we talk about a rule of life. It shapes life so that it becomes sanctified. It's almost like the way that frames work around a painting. What a frame will do around the painting is allow you to focus and see what you're supposed to see, that you might miss otherwise. And so by framing the day with regular prayer, there's nothing fancy pants about these prayers. I'm telling you, we read the Psalms, read some scripture. There's some terrific, beautiful prayers in there. But, I've been praying them for a whole lot of years. It's not like, oh, I've never seen that. But the routine of it, and that may sound terrible, but it's not. It is a pattern that frees me in my ordinary life to begin, at least, to sense the presence of God. Now, in addition to that, I have to say writing, and I don't mean trying to write a book. I mean writing daily in a journal where I'm responding to scripture and other spiritual reading, where I get to lose myself. If you're really writing and you're not trying to make something beautiful or anything like that, you don't want anybody really to see it because it's not very good. I lose myself to that. And that's sort of letting go of the self that is at the core of my spirituality. Brother Lawrence was able to see God in the cutting of the vegetables as he was preparing dinner for the brothers, right? That's an image that I carry with me every day. In whatever it is I'm doing, my version of cutting the vegetables, and I'm a lousy cook, so that's probably a bad example, but that's what I'm aiming for. And having a prayer rhythm is what cracks open the rest of life for me.
And in this podcast, we talk often about washing the dishes, trying to make washing the dishes something of a contemplative or holy practice.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And this is a pretty Benedictine thing too. And for me, God is in the ordinary. I'm not saying that God isn't in extraordinary things like sunrises and shooting stars and so forth, because God certainly is. And there are wow moments where we are caught up in awe, absolutely. But in the ordinary life, there's God. And sensing that is sort of the meat and potatoes of my life.
That's great. Well, what's next for you?
I right now, I was sharing with you before we started that there are some really big, important meetings that I've got. One of which is the Lambeth Conference, where all of the bishops of the Anglican Communion all around the world gather. And that I'm actually really looking forward to that, because it's, it'll be exhausting, but something, that kind of diversity in Christ and finding unity in that, in different cultures and languages and ways of expressing Christ's love for us and our love for Christ and one another. I'm doing a lot of work to get ready for that. But in my writerly life right now, I'm looking at wisdom literature because I'm interested in, or feel called to look at, what it means to be a wisdom community. And by that, I don't mean we know how to make things happen, but that we make our awareness of God, that's how I read Fear of the Lord. It's more awe, it's more awe, this sense of, oh, God's here. How we anchor our common life in that, and how to help gather a community, with that being the center point of our lives. And I think that has a lot more to do with asking good questions and having openness than it does with insisting on clinging to dogmas in a certain way. And I'm not busting on dogmas. What I'm saying is that sometimes we sure can hide from the depths of faith by clinging to a dogma in a way that prevents us from ever asking a serious question. And so that's what I'm into right now, is exploring, what does the life of faith look like that looks like that? So that's where I am next. And I'm early on, so that, that all sounds probably pretty vague, but that's where I am. Yeah.
By dogma, you mean kind of this presupposition that, well, I was just taught this, and so that's what I believe.
Yes. Well, I grew up Roman Catholic, so I know the catechism, right? And there's nothing wrong with catechisms. In fact, they're kind of helpful to go and look at it and think about. But you can think of your faith life as, and here's how catechism works. Here's a question, here's the answer. So you've already got the answer, you're done. Yeah. Right? And if you're done, I'm thinking there's not a lot of room for stretching. I used to teach philosophy years and years and years ago, right? And I had this great student who was a Greek Orthodox guy. And he used to say, we're really, really small and God is really, really big. And anytime you encounter God, you're going to get stretched. And that's what I mean. I think having dogmas, it's a good thing. That is, these are ideas the church has been wrestling with for a really long time. And we seem to be playing within a certain frame of reference. And that's a good thing. But if you allow that to keep you from wondering and questioning, I think you miss out. Are you ever really going to completely get your head around God? No. And that's the lovely thing. Listen, if you ever get your head completely around a person like your spouse, well, that's a dead relationship. Right?
I was going to ask, does that happen? I've been working on it for 20 years. It's not. Haven't won it.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, Bishop Jake Owensby, thank you so much for stretching us today. And really appreciate you taking the time, especially in the midst of the messiness of, well, life for all of us, but in your particular context in Louisiana right now. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, it's been a delight to be with you. I've really, really enjoyed our time together.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, jakeowensby.com is a great place to check in on the good bishop. If you'd like some more info on the Compass podcast, check out umc.org/compass. You can also email us at compass@umcom.org. This podcast is a production of United Methodist Communications. If it's meaningful for you, then check out another episode. If you enjoyed this episode, then our episode on holy mischief and disruptions of kindness might grab your attention too, or our episode on creating change when you feel like you're stuck in the same. But in my opinion, they're all good. My name is Ryan Dunn. Pierce Drake will rejoin us on the next episode, and I hope you will too. Peace.